Hi everyone, welcome to SynerZip's webinar today. This is Jill Hurston. I'm the Marketing Director at SynerZip located in Dallas. Before we start, I just want to remind everybody that I am recording this session and it will be sent out to you. You'll get an email from me tomorrow with a direct link to the slides and to the recording. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator today, Pankaj Jain. He's our VP of Software Services. Pankaj, over to you.
Thanks, Jill. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Agile Enough. So before we get started, let me quickly go over some housekeeping notes. As Jill mentioned, a webinar is being recorded, and you will get a link tomorrow with the presentation and the recording. So you can focus on listening to our presenter today. I encourage all of you to ask questions throughout the webinar. I'll try to get to all of them and ask at the appropriate times with our presenter. With that covered, let me introduce our speaker for today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mike Watson, VP Engineering at SynerZip. Mike is passionate about helping software product development organizations transition into strong agile practices and cultures. Mike and I visited our offices in Pune and spent a week working with our teams there. I was pleasantly surprised to see how well Mike played the national game of India, which is cricket. I hope to play again the game of cricket with Mike towards the end of the year again when we visit Pune office again. With that said, over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Pankaj, and thank you for your generous comments regarding my cricketing skills, which, by the way, are not that great. So thanks, everyone, for attending. This is my Agile Enough presentation, which is designed and aimed at software managers and leaders that are facing the challenge of how to deliver in an environment that may not be optimal for So I'm going to start off with a really obvious statement. Building software is indeed hard. We all know this. It's really not that interesting to talk about, I guess, but the things that make software hard is, one, software itself is a complex system, and by its nature, we don't intend to build the same thing over and over again. It's not like traditional manufacturing where you design something and then you optimize putting that together over and over again. In software, like I say, that is actually a non-goal. We actually want reuse and to try to build something new every time. The other thing that's hard about building software is the process for building software is also complex. So you have a complex thing you're building, and then you're backing it up with a process that's also very complex, or can be very complex. So let's step back in time to me as a youth. I was, one of the first in the information era where we watched TV while we were growing up at an early age, and we were able to see some interesting and fascinating live events for the first time, including watching a man walk on the moon, space launches, and also things like live war. It was the first time war was actually broadcast live. Because of that experience, I became personally very fascinated with space travel and the whole space program in general. And as a kid, I wanted to grow up and work for NASA. I wanted to help, promote the mission of getting people into space. My senior year of college, I wrote a thesis. My first stint of college. I wrote a thesis on what it would take to actually put a man on Mars, and so this was in early '90s probably. And so I was very fascinated with that. The other thing is I was found myself very good at personal computers, which were coming out at the exact same time frame, and I was very apt at programming at the time, and I was really interested in doing programming. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I put my fascination with space together with my aptitude for programming, and maybe I can work on guidance systems or like a time Space Shuttle was coming online, like tour systems or whatever. But then I quickly realized that building software is hard as I started trying it in college. And I didn't want to end up with a situation where there was a massive failure that caused people to be injured or killed, and it was my responsibility. I didn't have the stomach for that. So I quickly abandoned my hope for working on space travel, and I immediately moved into applications programming and business-to-business type software. So why am I talking about Agile today? Well, it's a pretty well-known topic in the engineering community, but what I want to talk about now is why I adopted it. Way back when, 20 years ago, when it was first coming around, it was the new thing. We strongly believed in our structured processes and data flow design, or whatever the things were at the time. And this Agile thing was new, and it was, I don't know if it was exactly scary, but it seemed like a way of developers getting around doing the right thing. That's how it looked to me. But after studying it, and I actually had a great opportunity to meet David Anderson, who was the author of the book that sort of brought Kanban to the current world. It's a great book, by the way. I had an opportunity to work with him, and we were studying process together. Mostly he was studying it because he was trying to write a book, and I was just being part of that process and learning. And I realized that Agile can give you two really good outcomes. One is it can reduce risk by shifting the risk from end of project, which normally happens in most traditional RAM projects. But it also can help you deliver the intended results. And I think in the lean and Agile world now, they're talking about like delivering the result that the customer actually wanted, right? So having the customer engage early and throughout the process, such that you don't end up with a huge divergence between what was expected and what actually came out. So better quality outcomes plus reduced risk. That was for me. That's why I personally adopted Agile. So the other thing is, I'm here talking about Agile. It's like that's just a well-known quantity in engineering, right? Well, the reality is it is well-known in engineering, but outside of engineering, the concept is pretty new. In fact, there was some great books on lean startups and things like that written not too long ago. I don't remember the exact time frame, but let's just say it was 5 to 10 years ago. So this concept of agility outside of the engineering department is pretty new. Like it's 5 years into it, say, and it's gaining traction and really helping, especially in startups. But for most people, most places that you're working, the business side of the house, outside of engineering, isn't that familiar with Agile practices. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I really have come to this strong belief that agility really depends on your customer profile. On one end, an application like Uber, you can be completely agile. You don't have a lot of demands from the customers. They basically take what they get. And if something fails in your Uber process, it's probably not going to be life-threatening or create a huge impact. Maybe you have to restart your app and then it works, or maybe your credit card doesn't work and you have to put a different one in. Like these are small problems in the grand scheme of things. Whereas if you look at a company like Abbott or anyone who's building healthcare applications, and you think about, like, for instance, a surgical laser, you can't have that kind of attitude with a surgical laser. It has to work or you don't use it. So you need a very disciplined process, a lot of structure. Now you can have agility within that structure, but overall you need a process that's going to strongly define what the outcomes need to be, a process that very rigorously determines that those outcomes are working 100% and ultimately deliver that product. But in the middle is everyone else. And Microsoft's on this slide, but I don't know if that's the best example, but you can think of hundreds and hundreds of business-to-business or business-to-business-to-consumer type companies that fit into this space where you have customers, there's contracts, customers have demands, and you have to retain customers. And so there's all these business factors that make it so that true agility is difficult. You can't just deliver what you want when you want to. You actually have to meet these customer demands so your business can continue to run and make money. So one of the things that I find when I go into a new situation is I find a lot of resistance. And I've sort of coined this term recently, and I call it Agile Resistance. So it's the idea that some people either can't get their head around it or they're unwilling to participate in this Agile concept. I think like when you talk about salespeople, they're very driven on like, let's get that customer, let's meet all their demands, and they're not really worried about how those demands are going to be met. If you're in a product division, product-driven company, with very few exceptions, generally the customer knows better than the product managers. I think there are some great exceptions, like Apple is a very innovative company and came up with products that nobody would have ever asked for. And the process of asking the customers what they want wouldn't have worked in that case. But in most cases, most of the problems we're solving are pretty well known. There are definitely exceptions. And so having, being highly in tune with your customer and what they need is really important. Larger organizations, they have CTOs that are like really want to make sure their money is being well spent, and so there's a lot of processes and procedures to make sure that you're properly estimating and figuring out, what's going to happen for that year, which again doesn't really help with agility. It's a form of resistance. And then finally, it's just people are resistant. People don't like change. In fact, I even had an example earlier when I was first adopting Agile. I was resistant to it. So I totally get that.
Hey, Mike, so one question that came up on this slide, this is a great slide, but Brian is asking, he works for a little larger organization, so he understands Agile and he wants to implement, but his group, I think his company has different divisions, they are not into Agile, so he's facing Agile resistance. So Brian's question is, how do you go about influencing the resistance?
Yeah, it's a great question, Pankaj. And actually, I think if we ask that question again towards the end of the presentation,
okay,
we answer, because a lot of the rest of the presentation is going to be how I've approached this problem. And there might still be some questions at that point. So let's walk through it and see where we end up.
Okay.
So some telltale signs of resistance, you'll see friction between teams. This comes in the form of like, I need stories written in a certain way, and then maybe product management says I don't want to do that, or I can't do that. You might see test teams that want to wait for everything to be done before they get started. There's all sorts of different ways that this friction can happen, and a lot of times, people get very heated because their objectives are difficult to meet without this friction being there. There's also an emphasis on rituals and process over the mindset. I think the mindset's more important than whether you're using Scrum or Kanban or any other cobbled together methodology that fits an Agile mentality. Then finally, there's this concept that I have called the Agile ceiling. Now, the Agile ceiling is the idea that at some point in the organization, you're going to get to a point where you just can't change the mind of that organization. So, for instance, like if you're in that very large company, you're very unlikely to affect senior management or high-level aspects of the business, like maybe the business unit. Heads, general managers and such. And so you may find that but also I found in the past that it could be IT, it could be an organization like IT that is unwilling to adopt modern DevOps practices that make the whole development process, or they're not willing to get engaged during the development process to help solve problems that ultimately will come out as you move towards production. So when I think about the agile ceiling, again, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Is an igloo came to mind, and why an igloo? Because an igloo doesn't really have walls; it arguably just has a ceiling. And so, as you think back, what is your ceiling? Like, if you look at your company, you want to find that ceiling. Like, is it IT? Is it sales? Is it the customer themselves are unwilling to work with you? I've seen it all, and it can be very frustrating. So the more and more I thought about this, I came up with this idea that there's probably some.
Mike,
yes, go ahead.
If I may interrupt this, a couple of questions are coming on this agile ceiling thing. So one of the things is, can you talk a little bit more about, like Sandy is asking, there are teams where they just consist of the developers, and then there are teams which is developer plus QA. Some different agile teams include dev, QA, and PM. So how do you define this agile ceiling? Agile, is it only developers or whatever that agile team is? So that's one of the questions. So if you can a little bit elaborate on that one, that would be good.
Yeah, I'd be glad to elaborate on that. So stepping back again, so imagine this is the mindset of say a development manager, so someone that runs development. The agile ceiling for them could be anywhere, right? It could be QA, it could be product management, just like suggested there. Or it could be, outside of that. It could be, like say, the customer or IT. And so definitely you can see it. And I have examples that I'll go through that include all of these areas.
Perfect. Okay.
So yeah, I think it's the right mindset to say that this is a development-oriented presentation, because my background is development and development management, and then ultimately leadership above that.
Okay.
All right, so agile enough. So agile enough is not a science. It's actually a feeling. So I've come to this feeling at a few places that I've worked. I tend to go, so my profile is I tend to go into organizations that are struggling with their agile transformation, or they're not even starting an agile transformation, and I go in and I help them make that transformation. And what I've found in those situations is sometimes I haven't been able to bust past the ceiling. So there was so much resistance that it just wasn't possible to get to agile enough. But there were several cases where I did, and it really came down to just a very good feeling amongst the leaders of that organization that things were going well. These bullets are examples of those. And I think, the key example here is that there was strong trust between what the delivery team was doing and what they said they could do and what the business team needed, and what they, truly what they need. So engineering trusted that the sales team was actually selling what we had and that they knew the customer really well, but also that the engineering team, when they said they were going to deliver something in a certain time frame, they reliably did so. With those two things happening, these other points come in. So I had a manager at one of the places where he was constantly riding on us to do more and push. And one day I realized that the reason why I was pushing is not because I didn't trust we could deliver. He just felt that if he pushed a little bit harder, he would get a little bit more, like that we weren't working at 100% efficiency or whatever that was. It was an interesting mindset that he had. And it sort of changed my mind about how leaders push like that. They're trying to get a little bit more. And I think that's okay as long as there's some balance to that. Like if we're pushing people unnaturally so they're always working too many hours and don't have a good work-life balance, that's probably not the right answer. But to try to push to get a little bit more to make a business objective, that's probably good leadership. So the key to expanding agility, again, this is all through my experience, is you need to evolve the culture to have a mindset of agility. It's not just about here's the Scrum process, go run it. It's about how do I think in a way that allows me to run my processes in a very efficient way that focuses on the right outcomes, focuses on transparency such that you can deliver, if not on time, at least everyone knows when you're going to deliver. I think one of the things that I find with agility, I find two different things that are interesting about agility. And when you talk about it generally, is a lot of people think Scrum and Agile are the same thing, which I find really interesting. And second, I think people think that if you're doing an Agile process, you'll always deliver on time, which I also think is very interesting. It's not true. If you're delivering well in an Agile process, you'll always know what you're going to deliver and when you're going to deliver it, but it's not necessarily going to always meet the business demands. But if you have that transparency and you see those issues early, you can keep negotiating with the business side of the house to change the scope, change the delivery date, work with the customers, make them aware so that these decisions are done proactively and not reactively. Because no one likes a surprise at the end. Nobody likes to give the surprise. Nobody likes to hear the surprise. And so I think that's a great aspect of agility. And if you have the right mindset, that's what you're going to be able to get. Now, one caveat, and this this actually is, I thought was pretty funny, but like maybe a little difficult to follow. But if you try to push too hard, you may end up with an unintended consequence. And what this is basically saying is, here's this bacteria that we have, we're able to deal with medicine, and then ultimately, because we dealt with it so much, the bacteria itself evolved to the point where now we can't deal with it with the medicine. So it's resistant to our medical treatments, which is unfortunate. So what we want to avoid is a situation. So to translate this to this topic, what we want to avoid is we don't want to push the resistance so hard that it actually becomes more resistant, right? We want to break down the barriers, get less resistance and more agility. But if we push too hard or we do it in the wrong way, we could end up in a worse position than we started.
That's a good question, Mike. Mike is asking a question. So he's a part of a larger organization with many date commitments, right? Contracts and all the other stuff. They are often in those deliverables are far in future, right? So the development team wants to be agile, but while still doing the long-term capacity planning and commitments, right? Based on calendars and headcounts, not the points as we talk about in agile world. So how do you plan next 18 months but build with agile? That's his question. So if you can talk a little bit about that part, that we could, or should I ask towards the end?
No, that's actually I don't address that specifically in the presentation. So let's go ahead and attack that right now, because it's a very difficult challenge, and I've tried multiple different approaches. But what I've really, and there's a couple of modern thought process on this, where there's the no estimate approach, and then there's the, which obviously has failings in this particular example. But then there's the sort of good enough estimate approach, where you try to spend minimal resources to get an idea. Now, what I've done that I found has worked really well is if you can get enough definition of the 18-month roadmap, you can define the features enough, and which is really a high level. Maybe it's just a paragraph, depending on the nature of your business. You can compare that to other features you built in the past. If you have good metrics from the past, you can say, well, this feature is a lot like that feature. That's the same risk profile. It has, similar sizing, similar characteristics, same amount of UI or backend. However you want to look at that. And I call it pattern matching. And so I'll go into a session, and maybe this will be a 2-hour session where I say, okay, here's our 24-month plan of all these features that we have to build. And there's very little description on them. And we come up with 2 outcomes. One is, does it look like anything we've ever done before? And then that sometimes is a difficult conversation where we have to really kind of dig and dig and dig to say, okay, it looks like this thing. But then we also look at how much risk is in it. So how much gray matter actually exists in that, and sort of give it a rating in terms of that. And with those two pieces of information, I can build a high-level plan. It's as good as any other plan, but I think the key of building that plan is that I've included the development team, or the engineering team in general, in the process, such that they have some kind of understanding and buy-in that they're not signing up for something crazy. And then with that overall plan, obviously you can turn that into resource needs and all that. But you have to be really careful that that isn't a plan. That is just sort of a template for a plan that could possibly be the right answer. And a lot of times the challenge there is that once you say, we can do this much in 18 months, you sort of get tricked into actually committing to that. And I would try to avoid that.
Okay.
And I do talk about ways that you can avoid that later.
Sounds good.
So how do we gain momentum? So like I say, I've done this process several times, so I have a pretty good idea here. So the very first thing you have to do is you have to make sure, like if you own development in that example, you have to make sure that you're actually doing a good job of development. Like if you're all over the place and you're just trying to blame other teams for your failings because they made it more difficult for you, that's probably true that they did make it more difficult for you, but until you kind of have your work going well and people understand that you're minding the details yourself, like you're writing unit tests or whatever it is the proper procedure is, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go out to other teams and ask them to change. A second really big problem that has to be tackled is goal alignment among constituents. So in the example of you're just dev and you want to work with QA and product management, keep it simple, you have to make sure that the product management and QA goals actually align to the same goals you have. Your goal is to produce so much output in so much time, like some level of throughput, however that happens to be measured. You have to make sure that the other two teams in this example are also committed to that same goal. They may not have it defined exactly the same way, but it should be close, because goal misalignment is the number one reason teams don't work well together. The next thing is identify the resistance. You might find situations where there's unnatural resistance due to baggage that we keep from the past, and I can give you a good example of this. I worked in a team where we had pretty much a waterfall process, but in development had adopted test-driven development, which is something from way back in history that nobody really knows about, but it's a lot like Scrum, but there's a upfront design phase where you do some modeling of the problem in a conceptual model, like an ER type model. And then from that you break out features, and then you deliver on those features. And then you repeat, you do more modeling, and then features, and run sprints, et cetera, et cetera. But in this world, the QA team was absolutely against working in parallel with development. In fact, the QA manager, felt very strongly, very passionate about his role as a QA manager. He wanted to make sure that the quality was perfect, and he felt like his job was to make sure there was perfect software being delivered. And so in order to meet his goal, he felt very strongly that development had to be done before he even got started. So this is very classic waterfall. It's all development's done, all features are done, checked in, deliver, build to QA, and then they go through their testing, and then ultimately regression testing and deliver. So this process was for us at the time, was a 12-week process. It was 7 weeks of development and 5 weeks of QA. And I thought we could trim that down. I thought we could go a lot faster if we could get QA to buy in. So I worked with him to find out what his actual concerns were. And his concerns were all around shifting sands, right? So you deliver me a build and I test the feature, and then you deliver another build, that feature could be broken and I have to go back. And so I can't really count any of my test cases as completed. And so I thought about that a lot, and I basically came up with actually a fairly simple solution. It might even be considered an easy win, although it took a long time to convince him. What I told him is, how about your testers aren't really doing much during the 7 weeks. I mean, they're writing test cases, but it probably doesn't take 7 weeks to do that. why don't you have some of your QA look at features as they get done? We were on a weekly cadence where we'd deliver anything to QA or to our staging area. Every week, if a feature was ready, we would deliver it. If not, nothing would be delivered in it. Because this week after week, we were delivering and said, why don't you look at those early deliveries, run a first pass on those, and tell us how they work, right? Are there showstoppers or blocking issues, or maybe they're working generally fine? Typically, there were always major issues. And by doing this, we are actually able to streamline the back end of the QA process, and ultimately, with just this one change, early investigation of bugs, and development focused on fixing those before we got to code complete, we actually trimmed 2 weeks out of that process. They were able to do 1 week of feature testing for whatever came at the end, and then 2 or 3 weeks of regression. So I think it was 2 weeks typically. And so we were able to get essentially, my math is bad here, but 20% increase in throughput for just one small change, just negotiating a small difference in how we behaved, and it had a big reward. Look for easy wins. This is always a good idea, especially this is just good leadership. If you go into a new position, you want to try to get some wins early, get some confidence behind you, gain your own confidence. And then finally, you don't want to change too much at once. A lot of times I see people going in, or I've come in after someone has done this, where they have dumped on, like, here's Scrum, go make it happen. And we want to follow all those rituals and ceremonies. And there's no training. It's just all plopped at once. And that usually doesn't go over well, because that's just too overwhelming, especially if you've never done it before. If you actually dump it on a team that's already done it before, maybe it would work. But they're probably already doing it anyway, if that's the case. So in my research for this presentation, I talked to a lot of peers, and one of them turned me on to this quote, which I thought was great and very relevant. It basically states that in order to have a complex system, you had to start somewhere that was simple, and you build up from that. And if you try to do the other way around, to my point about just dumping Scrum onto a team, it's probably going to fail. Now, one caveat I have to this is, if you have an existing process, you don't have to throw it away, which is the last thing on here says you have to throw that away and start over. But you do have to pare it down to the things that you know are working, right? So look at your existing process, look at what's working, and really focus on locking those down, and then change things around that so you have a good solid base to work from. So it's kind of the same concept, slightly evolved. And that book I referenced on Kanban method by David Anderson actually talks about this as how to introduce Kanban. Is don't try to just say we're doing Kanban now, but actually figure out a way to like slowly introduce it, get it working, and then expand upon it to its full benefit. And so that's a good read if you're interested. And by the way, David Anderson and I are not friends. we used to argue a lot, but we do highly respect each other.
Mike, just Sandy is saying this is a great quote. In the last slide, you mentioned this one, John quote. She really likes the quote, and it makes it simpler for her to understand. Just wanted to pass it by.
Yeah, so part of our job when we're trying to expand agility is to sell agility, right? And I think by attacking it from different angles and explaining things, like what I'm trying to do in this presentation, it makes it that much easier to sell it, because everyone has a slightly different view, and something different about the various parts of agility are going to resonate with some people. Like I say, this resonated really well with me, so I'm glad it does with others. So this slide I designed for the true developer out there. There's no graphics, it's just a strict bulleted list. I've built many of these slides in the past, but really it is intended for anyone in engineering. Really, it's really important for people to know how to do something. You can't just expect them to do it by like here's Scrum, like I said, here's Scrum, and you talk about it a little bit. You actually have to teach them, get them training, whether it's formal or informal, and constantly reinforce the concepts. If you don't do that, you're not going to get this evolution in their mind to this agile mindset. Stick to the basics. An example here is I had an opportunity to work within SynerZip, I had an opportunity to work with a small startup group where essentially we were providing all the technology for this group. And we were starting from scratch. So I introduced Kanban, but I introduced it in a very simplistic way. I created the board, basic swim lane, maybe there was 4 steps. And I said, let's just track everything here and make sure it's all tracked. And over time, what we realized is, we would pile up too many cards in one of the swim lanes. And sorry, I'm saying swim lanes, but I mean columns. And so too many cards would pile up, and there was there wasn't a smooth flow of issues from development to QA. So I started introducing the more advanced concepts of Kanban, like buffering, like the buffer columns, and also WIP limits. And when we started introducing those concepts, when people saw what was happening and how these things, by adding these buffers and WIP limits in, how it fixed the problem, then they started understanding, oh, that's what Kanban's talking about. And it's not just this theoretical thing; it actually solves a real world problem. So that was interesting to see, and I would definitely recommend an approach like that, whether you're using Kanban or Scrum. I think a cadence is very important, and this is basically the idea that humans work better with recurring meetings, like the idea that every Thursday we're going to do a backlog grooming, and every Friday there's going to be a demo. It's much easier to put that on our calendars and to remember and show up engaged every week over week. Whereas if you do those ad hoc, then people may not be prepared, or they might not remember that they're on their calendar. So I think cadences are very important in software. Whether that's a sprint cadence, which builds that in, like Scrum has that built in, or whether it's Kanban with a cadence added on top of it, which is my preferred process. Establish metrics is very, very important. You can't really define goals and tell whether you're meeting goals, whether if you don't have metrics. But also, you can't truly know if you're improving without metrics. Metrics give you facts about your improvement, whereas otherwise it's just a feeling. And then finally, and I can't stress this point enough, it's last because I want to talk about it as a stress point here, is transparency is absolutely key in agility. You can't hide facts. Everything needs to be out there for everyone to see, because the power of that communication is what's going to give you the best outcomes and build the most trust. It may be difficult at first to be transparent, but it's fundamental to success. And so that's Kanban boards and the metric, being able to do burn downs and burn ups and these types of charts and having them readily available to everyone all the time is I think fundamental to good hygiene and agile process.
Hey, Mike, that's a good thing on the matrix. I think you mentioned some of them, but Srinivas is asking, in your opinion, as you said, like to set up the goal upfront so everybody is aware of it and then you measure it. In your opinion, what are the key metrics, at least you would suggest teams should have, or the organization should measure? We can have different things, but in your expert opinion, what do you think are some of the key metrics you have seen working better?
Yeah, so I think the macro answer to that is difficult because every business has different objectives. But from a micro standpoint, like looking just at the engineering team and delivery of, we'll call them sprints, there's 3 things that I like to focus, or actually bigger than sprints, let's say releases. There's 3 things I like to measure that I think are very important. And one of them is the traditional burn up, burn down understanding of how you're doing against your future objectives. So, you have a certain number of stories and they have to be done in a certain amount of time. Are you knocking out stories in a reasonable progression? And I always try to come up with a predicted path for that versus the straight line. Like, traditionally a burn down or we'll have a straight line, and I call that the naive burn down trajectory. More realistically, and I probably should have had a slide on this, but more realistically, it's more of a bowed line with a little bit more going to be delivered at the end, just because of the nature of starting a project. And so I try to come up with a good prediction of what the flow is going to be, and then track that flow and burn down. So that's number one. Are we moving incrementally towards our goal? Are we finishing stories? Because finishing stories is absolutely fundamental. You don't want to get to a point where you're 80% through the project and nothing's finished. I call that 80% of nothing. It's not a good place to be in, right? So it's really important to focus on completing stories and getting them through the process as early as possible and as often as possible. So that's number one. Number two is I do the same type of thing for bug projections. So I like to project out how bugs are going to be discovered throughout the process, because as you start delivering to QA, bugs will occur, and you need to understand how that bug pileup is happening and how you're going to reduce that, ultimately how you're going to reduce that bug pileup, which is where the other set of metrics comes in, which is your find and fix rates, having a good understanding of your find and fix rates such that you can do a bug projection and figure out when your actual end date is going to be. Because typically why projects go late is because there's too many bugs. It's not necessarily because you're not done with the features, it's because there's too many bugs in those features that you've delivered, whether they're regression bugs or new bugs, and they overwhelm the team at the end. And so having a good understanding of what that flow is going to look like from historical evidence, and then being able to track to that through your metrics will help you gain confidence of when you're actually going to deliver.
Sounds good.
That's it for me. Hopefully that satisfies the answer.
Yeah.
One other thing, at the macro picture, just not to totally punt on that, I think throughput is really important. So how many units of interesting features are you building over a certain amount of time? And then you can factor that into cost too. So I think, like I say, depending on how you define features and scope, and it becomes complex how to calculate that. But really, ultimately what we want to do is produce the most value for the resources applied to it. And so that can be measured through throughput, or throughput over cost.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, so a few tips and techniques that have worked well for me. This is just my select few. So one of the problems that we talked about earlier is how do you deal with the fact that you're going to deliver something reliably, but it may not be everything that somebody wants. And so one of the things that have come up in modern thought process is this idea of range buffering, which is basically you say I can deliver 100% of this functionality between, let's just say, May 1st or May 31st. Like you have a month range that says, somewhere in there we'll be finished, but we don't know exactly when. And I think that's I think in theory that works really well, but in practice what I've seen is whenever I tell my senior managers, it's going to be either May 1st or May 31st, they're like, okay, May 1st it is. And they basically focus on the earliest date possible. And it's very hard to get them to focus on the latest date possible because, again, going back to the concept earlier of the manager who wanted to push, he's thinking, well, if I tell you the earlier date, then you'll work harder and we'll get more out of you. And so I quickly abandoned range, this idea of range buffering, and I came up with this concept of scope buffering, which is basically turning it on its end and saying, on May 1st, I can guarantee that you'll have 60% of everything that we've committed to this, and possibly more if everything goes well, but 60%. And so those are the things you can tell the customers that you're going to get reliably. And then the rest of it, we'll do our best to make it. So our plan assumes on May 1st, we're going to get 100%, but it also knows that there's risk and that the likelihood of 100% is not high. And that took a long time to sell, but once I gained the trust needed, this was very successful. And I never really tracked how much we built. I don't think we ever got to 100%, but I would say it was well over 80% of the functionality was built, even though we were only committing to 60. And everyone was very happy because nobody had to go back to a customer and reset expectations. Plus, extra stuff was being delivered that people ultimately didn't expect because we didn't commit to it. The next idea is proxy product owners. And this is for remote teams and specifically remote teams in separate time zones. I've dealt with that problem for a long time. I've always worked with teams either in China or India, and there's a huge time zone gap. And so what I've found is that the more you can push roles off into the same time zone, the better. And time zone is really what's critical. I think in the modern world, it's really easy to work from home. I'm in my home office in Austin now, and I'm very effective in that role. I think anyone in any role can be effective. There's probably some exceptions, but especially in engineering roles, the tools and technology allow us to work remotely. But the time zone thing is something that's much harder. And so, like I said, good agile practice, you co-locate teams. So if you're working with remote teams, if you can co-locate as much of the functionality together, then that's great. The main advantage is only the product owner, the proxy product owner in this case, and the product manager. They're the only ones that have to work crazy hours, and they can do that on some kind of separate cadence. And the rest of the team doesn't have to deal with massively changing their schedules to get to be effective.
Yeah, Mike, Ron is asking another question on this topic of product managers or product owners. He's asking is, can you talk a little bit about the importance of grooming the backlog? How often it should be done? Are there some standard practices? If you can touch a little bit about that, grooming the backlog.
Yeah, so if we're talking about grooming to make stories ready for, so there's a couple of possibilities. So one is we're talking about grooming such that stories are ready for development. That needs to happen as often as it needs to happen. I know that's kind of a lame answer, but it's a just-in-time activity. So if you're doing Scrum, it's every 2 weeks you need to make sure that you can have enough time to queue up 2 weeks of work, because in the Scrum process, you define 2 weeks of work, you commit to it, you fully define all the requirements about it, and then you execute on it. In a Kanban process, it's more just in time, where you want to build up a queue of things that are groomed, but you really don't have to add to the queue until something is removed from the queue. And so again, based on my preference of cadence, I would still say that you should have a backlog grooming meeting every week, just to make sure that that queue is not full. It could be a meeting where you're like, oh, the queue's full, let's skip it. But having that cadence makes it so that you're much more reliably going to do it. So again, my answer is really just in time, right? So let's make sure that whenever developers and QA, whoever's going to build the product needs something ready to go, it's ready to go. But at a macro level, if you go back to the 18-month planning session, I've done it monthly and I've done it quarterly, depending on the volatility of change. Do that higher level exercise. Probably quarterly is the right answer.
Sounds good. Thanks.
So I've talked about this a lot, and I'm going to add it in the tips and techniques because it's really was game changer for me. I was working on a project. It's actually the same project with the QA manager I was talking about. A senior level manager came in and said, "What's your heartbeat?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "Well, what's your cadence for delivery of all these things?" I'm like, "Well, we just deliver what we have when we have it." And he kind of shook his head and he's like, "I don't think that's a good idea." And basically, he convinced me of all the things I'm telling you now, which is that the psychology of having a cadence is so important for us as humans that you should have it. If you don't have one now, you should get one. I mean, even if you're working in a waterfall process, you should probably be delivering a build somewhere that you can do some kind of integration testing on at least once a week. Otherwise, you're just pushing that risk to the end. So what I hope you take away from this is that in most cases, you're gonna end up in a situation where there's an agility limit, where no matter how hard you push, you may not be able to break the barrier. Hopefully that agility limit still gives you agile enough. But it may not. Like I say, I faced that in the past. And it becomes a much harder challenge where you have to engage higher and higher ups in the organization to help with the culture shift. I think it's really important to try to be a little bit more agile than you were in the last cycle, whether that's, every sprint or every quarter or every year. There's always something you can do to be a little bit better, so don't lose focus on retrospectives and this idea of continual improvement. We talked about, again, establishing trust. Without trust, you're really going to have a hard time influencing anybody. So you really need to focus on that transparency and building that trust and really understanding the problems that your constituents are facing. Because a lot of times their doubts or their concerns, resistance is actually founded in something viable. Like it's not just that they're being difficult. They actually have problems they're trying to solve themselves and they're not sure how to do it. And then finally, really increasing agility or expanding agility is a cultural thing. It requires everyone buying into this idea that you can do things faster in this certain agile methodology or agile mindset. And what I found is that changing culture is much harder than building software. So it's a difficult challenge, but it's a worthy challenge, especially if you're responsible for delivery and you're struggling to deliver. It's worth pushing to make these changes. And with that, Pankaj, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. That was a great presentation. Everyone who's listening, I encourage all of you to keep entering your questions in the chat box. I will go through them towards the end while you are typing your questions. Let me go over next couple of slides about SynerZip. So if you have any questions, I think, Mike, can you go to the previous slides? If you have any question, please reach out to Mike on his LinkedIn profile, or also you can send this to our webinar organizers. Next slide, please. So at SynerZip, we work as your trusted agile software co-development partner, right? You get your own dedicated team of software professionals. We help our clients, basically our clients come to us for mainly one of the following reasons. They need to accelerate their product roadmap delivery, and we enable that by scaling their engineering teams quickly. Some of the clients come to us because they have a specific technology skills gap with their in-house teams. Maybe it's in AI, big data, DevOps, QA automation, or maybe it's Ruby on Rails or Scala or something. So we have over 500 plus software development professionals, so we work in all the cutting edge technology. Clients look to us, basically they do the distributed team development is to reduce the cost of software development, and working with over 150 clients over last 14 years, SynerZip had made clients save at least 50% of the cost saving. We do offer a dual share model where some clients wants to have on-site presence while working with the offshore teams. So the collaboration is easier. So that's that. Next slide, please. Just a snapshot of some of the SynerZip past clients. Over past 14 years plus, SynerZip has partnered with over 150 companies working with different domains, working on different cutting edge technologies. Majority of our clients are small to medium-sized venture or private equity-backed companies. However, we do have some large clients like Google and Dell, just to name a few. Our clients are all referenceable, and you can check the client's testimony on our website at synerzip.com. Next slide, please. Next month, our webinar is on May 16th, 10 a.m. Central. The topic will be Design Sprint Process, and it's given by a great speaker, Douglas Ferguson. He's the president at Voltage Control. I encourage each one of you to register and attend the webinar. So going back to, I have, Mike, a couple of questions that are coming. So one outstanding question from Brian early was how to influence the agile resistance. But before we go there, Lonnie is asking a question, and this is an interesting question. So she's asking, do you have an approach for managing a physical delivery project, that is conference room builds using Agile? So there is software development, I think I understand her question is specifically, you have a physical delivery of a project, right? How do you go about doing that using Agile?
Yeah, I think I don't have a great answer for that question, unfortunately. I think there are definitely people that have better answers than me, but typically what I've seen is if you can define the units, if you can figure out what a story is in that particular process that you're talking about, then and you treat those stories like software stories, then you should be able to take a process like Kanban and leverage it quite nicely. But again, I'm not an expert in that. I mean, my focus has been primarily in software, so I would hate to give an expert opinion on something I'm not an expert on.
That's good. Lonnie, so just for, if you are listening, just reach back to us, and then maybe Mike, and we can have other people within Synergy as we are Agile experts, we can answer your question. Coming back to the original question, Mike, Brian asked, how to influence the Agile resistance. So I think you went through your slides and you did go through stuff where you introduced the terminology Agile Resistance, right? So in your experience, can you highlight some of the things you have found to be working to overcome that Agile resistance within an organization, different organization, if you can think about it, small to medium size to large? Any ideas?
Yes. Yeah, so just circling back to some of the thoughts that I had, I think, like I said, understanding why there's resistance, the source of the resistance, figuring out what the business problem that the person being resistant is trying to solve, and working with them together in a collaborative way to adopt agility and still solve that business problem. So going back to that QA manager example, he really felt like it was really important that he manage the quality of the software, and he didn't want to mark any test case complete until he had final code. And so I came up with a way that allowed him to do that, but also to go faster. And so he got, the point that he was resisting on went away in a sense because he still got 100% of what he was trying to do. We just did it better. And so that's a big part of it. It's just understanding the problem. But again, it also goes back to goal alignment. Like if his goals were completely different than my goals, then we're going to be in deep trouble. And we'd have to go even another layer higher and say, is there a way that we can restructure our goals so that we're incentivized to work together and incentivized to be more agile?
Great. One of the other question, I think, one of the last questions I will ask, there are many questions, but Geraldo is asking, he really liked your concept of igloo ceiling. And so he's asking in this, your concept of igloo ceiling, is there a perfect agile team size in your opinion, whether it's 6 people, 8 people, or 12? How do you define that ceiling? So just asking an opinion from you.
Yeah, so my opinion is, I would say probably in the range of 5 to 12, maybe 5 to 9 if you wanted to tighten the range slightly. I think that works really well, especially if you can co-locate a team like that. But I don't think co-location is completely necessary, going back to some points I made earlier. So I think that's a really good team size. If you have to expand beyond that, I mean, there's authors like Ron Lichty, who did a presentation. I moderated a webinar for him for Synerzip in January. He writes a whole book on this topic, which I think is a great read. So if you want to investigate that further, I would suggest looking at Ron Lichty.
I think that's a wrap for today. Thanks again, Mike, for a great presentation. I'm looking forward to seeing you all in our Synerzip future webinars. And have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending.